Within a vast, mysterious universe, there spins the small planet Earth, home to a variegated human family. This variety provides many choices, many worldviews, and the richness that is possible from contributions by the various cultures, traditions, and fruits of unfettered free thought. The United States of America was the first nation to recognize the value of diversity and provided for it by means of the First Amendment to our Constitution, which separates our secular government from religion. Food for Thought Productions, in association with the Center for Inquiry West, is pleased to present the Executive Director of the Center, Mr. Matt Cherry, who spoke recently at a meeting of a local chapter of Americans United for Separation of Church and State on the question, is the religious freedom mandated by our First Amendment safe? Mr. Matt Cherry.
Thank you very much, Sylvia, for inviting me tonight, and thank you everyone for coming. Can you hear me okay with the microphone? Good. As Sylvia pointed out, I'm originally from Great Britain, and then I moved to Holland for a while before finally coming to the United States. So those of you who remember your high school history lessons may notice that I took the same route as the Pilgrim Fathers, who of course started off in England, and they left England to go to Holland for a few years, and finally came to the US. And I think if you study the history of the Pilgrim Fathers, it's quite instructive for tonight's topic. The Pilgrim Fathers left England because of the religious intolerance there. They felt that their own Puritan beliefs were not respected or allowed by the government, which was of a different religious persuasion. So they fled Britain to go to the relatively tolerant nation of Holland. And they were free to practice their beliefs in Holland, but they soon became dissatisfied because everyone else was free to practice their beliefs. And they found that the country was full of heretics and dissidents and all sorts of people they disagreed with. And they couldn't tolerate this themselves, so they came over to America, where they were given the freedom to practice their own beliefs, but to persecute everyone else and persecute all the people who came after them. And I think this is a very instructive lesson for this group tonight, because it's really the history of the early American colonies which defined the current state of religious freedom in the US. It was because of this tradition of religious intolerance in all the various states. As you know, in Massachusetts they had a very strong Puritan tradition, in Pennsylvania they had the Quakers, and in the South they have, as they do now, a very strong fundamentalist tradition. And each state had its own religious laws, blasphemy laws, they had their own laws about who could hold public office, and each sect excluded every other sect from power. So, when those damned rebels gained independence from the British and from the British Crown, which by the way is also the head of the Church of England, the first thing they did was to establish religious freedom in the US. They escaped from the traditions of the Puritans and the Pilgrim Fathers, and they made the First Amendment to the Bill of Rights to banish the establishment of religion in the US and to guarantee the freedom of all believers and indeed non-believers to practice and follow their own beliefs and their own conscience. And the United States of America was the first nation in the modern world to have this level of freedom of belief. It was the first nation in which there was no established church, in which there were no blasphemy laws. There were no laws stating what you must believe. And as in so many other areas of American law and culture, the highly successful American model of religious freedom has inspired many other countries around the world to establish freedom of religion and belief in their constitutions, in their countries. In my talk today, I want to look briefly at the state of freedom of belief around the world. I've been asked to keep my talk to about a quarter of an hour in order to allow plenty of time for discussion and debate from the floor. And since I'm naturally fairly long-winded, as Sylvia mentioned, I have a degree in philosophy, and I wouldn't have been given that degree unless my sentences lasted for more than a quarter of an hour. So I've done a bit of cheating. I've put a lot of information onto a sheet of paper, which was on your chairs. So I won't have to go over all of that. And if you happen to be interested, you can take it away and look at it. And what I want to do in my talk is to touch upon a lot of different issues and different areas and bring some topics up which I hope will be of interest to you. And then we can discuss it later in the main part of the meeting. And if there are areas where you want more information, you can always ask me to expand upon it further. So what I want to do tonight is to talk a bit about freedom of religion around the world, and then to briefly talk about the state of freedom of religion in the US, and then perhaps to raise some questions for you to pursue later. Before doing so, I should explain that my own particular interest is in the rights of the non-religious. I am a secular humanist myself, and secular humanists do not believe in God or the supernatural, and we are not religious. Instead, we believe that human morality and understanding should be based on the twin pillars of compassion and reason, and that these human faculties are purely human and natural. Of course, this does not mean that I think the non-religious should be given special rights and privileges. I believe that secular humanists should be given the same rights as the religious, and that there should be no preference for secular humanists or against them, that all beliefs and all religious traditions should be given complete freedom to flourish and pursue their own conscience. And I mention my own position because many of the illustrations I will give during my talk will refer particularly to the rights of the non-religious. But you should bear in mind that whenever the rights of the non-religious are threatened, you can be sure that the rights of other minority or unpopular religious beliefs will also be threatened. Before I talk about freedom of religion around the world, we should really define what is meant by freedom of religion or belief. In the US, you are probably very familiar, especially as members of Americans United for Separation of Church and State, you're probably familiar with the First Amendment, which really defines the terms of the debate in the US. And Sylvia read out the First Amendment earlier, and it says very briefly, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, in the international context, there is a different body of law, a different tradition which governs freedom of belief. And this has come from the United Nations, and it's far more recent, far more modern than the US tradition. As you know, the United Nations was founded after the Second World War, and these international laws and declarations weren't formulated until the last half century. And the most important declaration is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948. And this is really the basis of all subsequent human rights law around the world. And the particular article relating to freedom of belief is Article 18. And again, that's spelled out on the piece of paper on your chairs. And this says, everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief. Sorry about the sexist language. A few things have changed since then. And freedom, either alone or in community with others, and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. So basically it covers the same kind of rights as the American law, but with different wording and with some slightly different consequences. And you will notice that the international law doesn't just refer to religion, it constantly refers to religion or belief. And this is to make clear that it's not only religious beliefs that are protected, but non-religious beliefs. It's not only theistic beliefs that are protected, but non-theistic and atheistic beliefs that are protected. And all of these beliefs are protected equally. Now, freedom of religion or belief has always been one of the most controversial of the basic human rights. And many lawyers have described it as the most controversial right of all. And one of the interesting things about the right to freedom of belief is it's the one human right which governments not only contravene, because unfortunately all human rights are contravened by governments around the world, But it's a right that they contravene self-righteously. Governments not only contravene this right, but they say it's their God-given authority to contravene this right, and they're very sort of boastful and proud of it, and they dismiss it very violently. When the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was first drafted in 1948, every member nation of what was then the United Nations, and there was only about 50 nations then, every single member nation, bar one, signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Even Stalin signed it. Dishonestly, but at least he signed it. He recognized the moral power, even if he intended to ignore it. But there was one nation which refused to sign it, and they made a very strong point of refusing to sign it, and they refused on the grounds of Article 18, the freedom of belief, and that nation was Saudi Arabia. And they said from the very get-go, we have no intention of honoring the freedom of belief. It goes against our religious beliefs to allow apostasy and atheism and non-believers and heretics, and we refuse to have anything to do with this whole Declaration of Human Rights. So right from the very beginning, freedom of belief has been the most controversial and the most difficult of the human rights. And it remains one of the rights which is most often ignored. And many countries completely deny any pretense of freedom of belief for their citizens. I've already mentioned Saudi Arabia, but in Saudi Arabia, all religions, apart from the official brand of Sunni Islam, are banned or are treated with great prejudice. And many beliefs, including atheism, are treated automatically as capital offenses. And apostasy, the rejection of the belief of your forefathers, is also treated as a capital offense. And people are decapitated by sword in public squares in Saudi Arabia to this very day because of their personal individual beliefs. In Iran, apostasy is a capital offense. You can be a non-believer if your family, or you can be a Christian if your family were Christians or non-believers, but you cannot have a Muslim family and then adopt a different belief. That is a capital offense. And as the British humanist Salman Rushdie has learnt, the Iranian government is willing to export its laws beyond its own boundaries and to attack and threaten to murder, and in some cases they have murdered, non-believers abroad simply because of their beliefs. Now, of course, fundamentalist Islam has a bad reputation in the US, unfortunately, and it is perhaps an easy target, so you may not be surprised when I give these examples from the Muslim world, and you may think that these terrible transgressions of basic rights are limited to the Muslim world, but unfortunately they take place throughout the world today. To give one example from today's headlines, I think the conflict in Yugoslavia has a very strong component of religious intolerance. And I fear that when the smoke of battle clears in Kosovo, we will find that many of the same abuses of religious rights have taken place there as took place a few years ago in Bosnia. If you paid much attention to the war in Bosnia, there was a great deal of religious intolerance. It was often depicted as an ethnic war, but the people were from the same ethnic group and they spoke the same languages. The differences in Bosnia were religious. There were the Serbs who were Orthodox Christians. There were the Muslims who were from the same ethnic group as the Serbs and the Croats, but who had historically become Muslims. And then there were the Croats who were mainly Catholic. And it was the religious differences which fueled the ethnic hatred. And during the warfare, a lot of the violence was directed at places of worship which were desecrated because they were seen as symbols for the other side's ethnicity. And there was some horrendous examples of religious violence. If you had a strong stomach and listened to the war crime trials in The Hague of Serb soldiers who were accused of atrocities, one of the most common atrocities they were accused of was to carve a Christian cross into the bodies of Muslims to torture them to death. And you could have no clearer example of the religious motivation of these horrible crimes. Of course, these are extreme examples from places involved in warfare and totalitarian regimes. But even in the so-called secular West, there is very far from a situation of complete religious freedom. To give one example from my close to home, so I can pick on my own country, in Britain, or in England, we have an established church, the Church of England, which has many privileges and powers that go with being the official established church, the official religion of the country. An example from my own upbringing will illustrate the chronic entanglement of church and state in Britain. From the ages of 5 to 11, I went to a Church of England public elementary school, where, of course, it was a Church of England school. Of course, I was taught that the Bible was the truth, the Word of God. I had to pray every morning, and this is from the age of 5, so I wasn't really able to critically examine this requirement. And I was taught in all aspects to believe in the Church of England as the basis of all truth and morality. And this was at a public state school. And I did not go there because my parents were religious. In fact, my parents weren't religious. I went there because it was the only school in the neighborhood. It was the only free state public school in the neighborhood. And it's often claimed in America that if you had some religious schools supported by state money, people could always decide to go elsewhere. But if you live in a rural area or even in a small town and village, it may be the only school available to you is a religious school. After I was 11, I went to a school which was not a Church of England school, and yet I still had to pray every morning, and I was still given what is called moral instruction, which is, again, biblical teaching to teach you the Word of God. And this is from a country which is one of the most secular peoples in the world. In Britain, over 40% of the population do not have a belief in God. Only 3% of the population go to church every Sunday. And yet in this highly secular country, we are still sending our children to religious schools. We are still having compulsory prayers every morning. And you may be thinking this shows my age, that it must be way back in the mists of time that I was at school. But in fact, in 1988, the then Conservative government reinforced the religious education provisions to make sure that these laws were being followed, because they had fallen into some disuse because it was such a non-religious country that people no longer enforced daily prayers and daily worship. And the government made sure that that changed. So even to this day, English school children still have to have prayers every morning, still have to go to assembly, and still have largely Christian worship. I think this picture is true throughout much of Europe. There are still many established religions, established churches, and there's still a great deal of the relics of religious states. Now, in many other countries, there have been historic movements to separate religion and state. But increasingly, this separation of church and state is now under threat. For example, one of the greatest examples of a secular nation is the country of India. In 1948, when India gained independence from the British Empire, Nehru, who happened to be a humanist, made sure that the Indian constitution was a secular constitution. And he did this not to promote his own humanist views, but because he realized that in a nation of hundreds of millions of people, where there are many different great historic faith traditions, most notably Hinduism and Islam and Buddhism, that there had to be a secular state to kind of guarantee impartiality between these different communal groups. And India has done very well from its secular tradition. Unfortunately, since the mid-1990s, there has been a Hindu chauvinist political party gaining power in India, and they're trying to reverse the secular tradition in India. And they want to make India into a Hindu state, which would be called Hindustan. And the rights of the Muslim believers would be revoked, and they would have to follow Hindu laws, and the rights of the Christians and the Buddhists and the freethinkers and the Parsis would be subservient to the beliefs and traditions of the Hindus. And this model is gaining more and more popularity even within India, as it's seen as a way of sort of promoting an easy form of patriotism. India is a Hindu nation, and that's what is distinctive about it. And these Muslims and Christians are just invaders who should be made second-class citizens. So throughout the world, we see this struggle between the forces for secularism and freedom of belief and human rights, and the forces for religious orthodoxy and imposing religious beliefs, a particular brand of religious beliefs, on society. In some places, the forces for secularism have success. In Ireland, we see a retreat of the Catholic Church from its stranglehold on power. And we see for the first time that Ireland is now allowing divorce and allowing contraception and even allowing the right to choose abortion. In Sweden, there was a vote in 1997 to disestablish the Lutheran Church. So we see some progress, but we also see everywhere retreats from the secular tradition. I mentioned India, but also in Mexico and Turkey and many other developing nations where there was a secular state, the forces of political religion are trying to roll it back, and they're having a lot of success around the world. If I had given this talk 10 or 20 years ago, talking about freedom of belief, I would have given a lot of attention to the threat to religious faith from communism around the world. Fortunately, this has declined, and the enforced atheism, which used to suppress religion, has been overthrown throughout Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And we now find that the biggest threat to freedom of belief is religion itself, and the political forces that try to hijack religion for their own political agenda. And I think this model applies to the United States as well as it does to any other country. As I mentioned, the USA was the first nation in the world to ensure freedom of and from religion for all its citizens, and its principles of religious liberty remain a beacon to believers around the world. But although the constitutional wall of separation between church and state was established at the very foundation of the United States, it has required constant vigilance and activism to achieve and maintain that separation. And I have to say there have been significant breaches in that wall of separation. One notable example is from the 1950s McCarthyite era, when for the first time the US government added the words to the US Pledge of Allegiance, "One nation under God." And for the first time, the United States motto, E pluribus unum, which is a beautiful motto, from many come one, from many one, was replaced by one nation under God. And for the first time, American paper money had "In God We Trust" added for the first time in US history. So there were many setbacks to separation of church and state, as well as much advance. So the state of freedom of religion is not perfect in the US, but when you compare what I've just said to what I was saying about the Muslim world or Yugoslavia, it looks pretty good. We still have this First Amendment which protects our rights, and whenever Congress or the local federal assemblies try to impose laws which would favor a particular religious belief, which would discriminate against other religious believers or non-religious believers, we can turn to the First Amendment to seek protection. And we can turn to the law to protect us against the majority who may want to impose their own beliefs on minority believers. I'm going to come to a close now and open this up for discussion, but what I would like to do is to raise some questions for you to address. And in particular, I want to ask you two questions. The first one is, do you feel that the First Amendment and the historic achievement in America of having freedom of religion and belief is one of the reasons why America has been so successful as a nation, why the American model of freedom and liberty and constitutional democracy has been copied around the world? That may be a loaded question, but... And the second question is, to what extent do you feel this is under threat? To what extent is the First Amendment being challenged and may even be overturned? and what would be the consequences of this. So, thank you for your time, and shall I just open it up to questions straight away? If you have any.
Question. Do you think partitioning nations so that the different religious groups would have their own areas would eliminate the violence among factions?
I think the partition of India was an example of the dangers of this religious division, because there was huge bloodshed and turmoil, and in many ways the region is still destabilized by this division, especially now there's a nuclear arms race between the two countries. So I think it was a very bad thing in itself. And it didn't really solve the problem, because there were still 200 million, or there are now 200 million Muslims in India. India is the largest Muslim country in the world. It's just that the Muslims are outnumbered 3 or 4 to 1 by the Hindus. So there is still a very large minority. And to make India into a Hindu state would be very damaging to that quarter of the population, 30% of the population. So I don't think the partition really solved it. What it did do was to add a lot of attention to the problem, because what the Hindus do is to portray the Muslims as being really foreign agents. They're Pakistanis, really. They just happen to live in India, and they shouldn't even be treated as patriotic Indians, because their true allegiance is to Pakistan.
Comment. You compared the religious observance in this country with that in other countries, more religionist here than in other nations.
One of the interesting things when I compare England to America is that America has this secular constitution, and all its official legal structures are very secular, but its society, its people, are the most religious in the Western world. And in Britain it's almost the reverse. All the structures and constitutional stuff and all the arcane institutions are very religious, but the people are very non-religious. And it's often said to me that, well, maybe it's because there's a connection, maybe it's because you have a state religion that people react against it and become non-religious. And I reject that, because I look at the rest of Western Europe, places like France, which is even stricter in its separation of church and state than America, yet they have the same levels of non-belief as Britain. So I think the exception to the rule is America.
We hope you have found this program intellectually stimulating, and that you will continue to investigate the ideas raised here. To connect with other like-minded individuals, please contact any of the dozens of free thought organizations, such as the American Humanist Association, American Atheists, the Center for Inquiry, and Atheists United. You may also email the producer directly via leebaker27@gmail.com. This program has been distributed through the courtesy of Atheists United.